So quite a lot of you wanted a look at Data East's 1990s arcades. Happily it seems that the people's appetite is quite rife for games from a company that, as I said previously, isn't ever necessarily amongst people's very favourite arcade game makers, but still produced plenty of titles that people know, and a lot of games that are worth seeking out either for their qualities, or just for how plain strange they are. Data East weren't ever boring, even when they could occasionally be somewhat derivative of other people's work, and their 90s library continues that theme. We've got another pretty good range of titles here, that's for sure. We also have a few less games to deal with. There's 47 games here, just under half of the 98 we had to contend with in the 80s. There's no metric ton of deco cassette games to deal with this time, but Data East's arcade story does also end in the 1990s, unfortunately. They stopped producing arcades altogether in 1997 as their business diminished, leaving video games completely soon after that. Still, there's all sorts of intrigue in this time period, from the more famous titles to a bunch that never saw the light of day, including an arcade version of one of the UK's most successful gaming exports. Now, unlike the previous video where we went alphabetically through Data East's 1980s games, we'll take this one roughly chronologically. That makes sense seeing as there's a lot of sequels, spiritual successors and the like. So we begin with 1990, and our first title is indeed a successor to something that the company originally released back in 1985. Data East had their first crack at Boulder Dash back in 1985, with a game that was pretty faithful to First Star's Atari 8-bit original. The antics of Rockford were clearly positively received enough to warrant a second helping, and so Data East went back to Boulder Dash in 1990 with a new arcade. While a big part of doing this naturally involves bumping up the graphics and making everything a bit more cartoony, the 1990 Boulder Dash also features entirely new levels and enemies, including boss fights, as well as a couple of variations in types of rock and what have you. It doesn't differ wildly from the original formula, mind you. It's still all about digging in the dirt and collecting enough gems to open up the exit. And if that appeals to you, well, you're not going to find much wrong with this. At its core, it's a whole bunch of new Boulder Dash levels with a couple of little twists. It's fine. It's not too long before we reach the first Data East game in the vid that is completely wild to say the least. A lot of the best Data East titles are sublime in their ridiculousness, and that certainly applies to the Cliffhanger Edward Randy. It's another action game, and another game where our main hero is a dashing do-gooder with a whip trying to foil the evil machinations of a supreme demon in the 1930s who is hell-bent on world domination. So, you know, put two and two together. But just as Sly Spy was one of the best unofficial James Bond games, this is one of the best unofficial Indiana Jones games. I love how this title just goes off the rails immediately. You don't get any boring side-scrolling stages here. Every level is some sort of wild action set piece where you're fending off all sorts of goons with your whip, usually while you're on top of a plane, a boat, a truck, all sorts. And just when you think the game can't possibly get more outrageous, don't worry, it ups the levels again. This game sure is something. It's never dull, not even for a second, and its reliance on these auto-scrolling levels rather than more traditional stages certainly makes it stand out from the norm. Indeed, some may know that this game had a bit of influence on Treasure's almighty Gunstar Heroes. As detailed in Kurt Kalata's write-up on Hardcore Gaming 101, the fight against Orange on top of a biplane is similar to that of the final battle in Edward Randy, and two characters in Treasure's game were named Edward and Randy by artist Tetsuhiko Han Kikuchi as something of a tribute to Data East's title. Definitely one to play if you've never tried it before. Next, we have Dark Seal. I always think of this game as something of a successor to the earlier Shackled. That was Data East's attempt at Gauntlet, and this has something of a similar medieval-cum-fantasy theme while improving a hell of a lot of things. Anyway, this is the first Dark Seal game, also known as Gate of Doom, and it allows you to pick either a knight, wizard, bard or ninja for a quest against various denizens of the underworld. It's an isometric title, your heroes all vary somewhat in abilities and perks, and not only can they upgrade their equipment as long as they're able to keep fighting, they can also build up various spells. These elemental powers can certainly help you out providing you use them at the right time, and there's quite a few to choose from. It's a neat game on the whole, and it does have some quite nice music to go with it. Indeed, it's probably a title that should be better known, and it's certainly got some pretty good write-ups at the time. The fact that Dark Seal never ended up leaving the arcade, despite being a popular game on its release, probably has something to do with it not being as well remembered as other similar titles, although happily MAME and more modern company collections rectify the balance there somewhat. Peter Pepper's back, and this time it's personal. Okay, perhaps it isn't. Super BurgerTime is just a simple little revival of one of the company's most popular Golden Age titles, one that sticks more to our great chef's roots than the earlier Peter Pepper's Ice Cream Factory. There are a few additions, mind you. Not only can Peter jump, but he does get a lot more use out of various weapons, from the traditional pepper shaker to others such as spatulas and frying pans that you can pick up from the side of the stage. This turns out to be quite handy, seeing as this game tends to feature a lot more enemies than the original title, and as usual they're going to try to stop you assembling those yummy looking burgers, although some of the enemies, particularly the eggs, can be stunned and squashed inside of the bun, which makes for a neat bonus. Peter can also jump. You need this now not just to potentially avoid your foes, but also to hammer those buns and fixings down. You jump on them multiple times instead of walking over them. These little changes in the mechanics do work out rather nicely in the end, and even if the original BurgerTime is always going to be the better remembered game, this isn't a bad update at all. Crude, or Crude Buster, is the post-apocalyptic follow-up game to Bad Dudes, a sobering look into the horrific and smashed-up future world of 2010. It's a similar style of side-scrolling beat-em-up, although our heroes are much more punky and muscular, capable of throwing all sorts of fins around at the lousy terrorist scum who decided to make a bit of an irradiated mess of New York City. You probably also know this game as Two Crude Dudes, of course. However, it didn't actually get that title until it was ported to the Mega Drive a couple of years later. Anyway, I'd say that this game's got quite the enjoyable vibe about it, although in the end Bad Dudes is still the better game. This does at least have a bit more of that strange Data East humour about it, mind you, coming off like their typically twisted take on a trashy V-movie. And it is quite fun to be able to pick up most of the objects that are lying about. The first time that you realise you can actually just flat out pick up a freaking car and send it flying towards an enemy's face isn't just hilarious, it's the moment when you realise that these two shade-wearing and cigar-chomping brawlers are a fair bit stronger than your average hero. It's a cool game that certainly fits the Crude billing. It's licensed game time, and Data East are quick to try and ride the big old beat-em-up zeitgeist, especially the hunger for licensed ones that existed after the runaway success of Konami's Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles in 1989. Data East decided to go for Captain America and the Avengers, putting this game out in 1991 complete with two versions, a 2-player and 4-player cabinet, and the ability to pick from a selection of 4 members of Marvel's signature team. Now, if this game were more popular, I suppose you'd say that Captain America and Iron Man were the ones whose controls were more likely to be worn out from overuse, while Hawkeye and Vision would probably still play pretty okay. As it is, this is a perfectly acceptable beat-em-up, despite being kind of far away from the market leaders graphically and technically. One thing I do appreciate is always having a long-range attack to hand, whether it's the Captain's signature shield or Hawkeye's arrows, that's always available without diminishing your energy bar every time you use it. Nowadays the title's probably picked up more notoriety for some of its comedic translation errors. People could study this arcade for years and still have no particular idea what "why should it goes well" actually means in response to "don't disturb us." On the whole, this is the sort of game that I do remember playing quite often back in my own arcade days, and so I get a little nostalgic kick out of playing this one, even if, honestly, it doesn't rise too far above mediocrity. Chinatown, again from 1991, is our first full-blown puzzle game. Seeing as we don't have a deco cassette system to play around with anymore, we don't really get any utterly straight attempts at something like Mahjong in this 1990s selection of games, although Chinatown is as close as you get to one. This is a fall-in blocks game where the purpose is to construct tricks and fill up your hand using the Mahjong tiles. To my basic understanding, this either involves joining up 3 identical pieces or pieces that make up a sequence. The mechanics here seem perfectly reasonable, I suppose, and there are a few modes to play with, but obviously I would get a bit more of a grip on this title if I were totally familiar with the sets of Mahjong tiles and how they sequenced beyond the more obvious dot and bamboo suits, although that's hardly a fault of the game itself. So yeah, you might enjoy this if you're more familiar with Mahjong than I am. I really ought to dive into one of those much-loved Yakuza games someday. I understand that'll give me a bit of an education in Mahjong, amongst other things. So, as previously mentioned, Data East do have a bit of a reputation for making derivative titles, trying to ride the coattails of much more famous games, and as much as I clearly like Data East a lot, it's not exactly undeserved. A bit later on we're going to see their most infamous example, one you may well already know, but there sure are plenty of others, and that leads us on quite neatly to Desert Assault, otherwise known as Thunderzone in Japan. It's a top-down run and gunner, and it can be summed up in a few words as being a hell of a lot like Capcom's Mercs. Snake and Eagle from Bloody Wolf return here, along with 2 other commando compadres. They get the orders to beat up on some terrorists from not Colonel Troutman here, and then they go out there and do it, Mega Crashers and all, in a somewhat overly familiar environment. On the whole, I would say that this is pretty ban average, and I'd certainly rather play Mercs any day, but it does do a couple of things worthy of note. It certainly looks quite nice, and perhaps best of all, it does have a 4-player version. Now I can certainly see this game being a hell of a lot more entertaining with a quartet of Crusaders blasting everything in sight, certainly a lot more fun than it is in plain old single player. Obviously I have to concede that this is clearly going to be a much better game if you've got those people around, which, I don't. Here's one of Data East's more popular games from the decade, Joe and Mac, or Caveman Ninja, which is how the game was known here in Europe. This prehistoric-themed side-scroller, complete with all kinds of humour, is another example of Data East being pretty good at this sort of game. Something about their arcade side-scrollers always seems to end up working, with stages that always end up being just about the right length, a whole lot of serious weapon chunking or punching and kicking going on at the hordes of enemies, and a good amount of memorable set pieces, boss battles and the like. A lot of arcade fans would say that this sort of side-scrolling action game reached its apex when Nazca gave birth to the Metal Slug series, and I wouldn't disagree with that, but this sort of game from Data East makes its own fine contributions to the genre. I guess the only truly bad thing I could say about Caveman Ninja, really, is that it is kind of an example of that classic early 90s coattail riding. I fail to see how Joe and Mac are ninjas in any way, shape or form. But of course that's just plain amusing, more than anything else. This game is still as enjoyably silly as it always was back in the day. Right, here's a very interesting one that never came out, although it is a game you likely know. It's Lemmings. Following the huge success of this glorious mammal-saving puzzler on the Amiga, the game naturally appeared on plenty of other platforms, computers, consoles. There's a lot of ports, and there was a plan for an arcade one published by Data East USA. Naturally, you might wonder just how Lemmings would have worked as an arcade game, but there's some interesting ideas here in this prototype. A bunch of the original's levels are included here, with the graphics largely the same as the Amiga, although there are some additions like having Lemmings glow if they've got a job such as climber or floater attached to them. There's also a bunch of new speech samples and some rudimentary music that's familiar, although clearly unfinished. Control is done via trackball with a couple of buttons, one for picking and assigning jobs, of course, and another we'll get into shortly. So how do you try and limit a person's time on a game like Lemmings? Well, instead of having an individual timer for each level, as in the regular game, you have a global one that rolls over to the next stage. If it runs out, you need to insert a credit, although you can earn extra time if you save enough lems. So there is an incentive to complete levels as efficiently and as quickly as possible, which is where the second button comes in. That is the fast forward. You ought to use this whenever you can, especially when you've essentially done all that you need to get the lems to the goal. The fast forward is actually this prototype's main contribution to the series. The DMA bods thought that it was such a good idea that it would be included in every Lemmings game going forward. There's other little changes that speed up things. You no longer get a countdown either when you use a bomber or if you choose to nuke the poor sods after screwing up. So why did this never get past the prototype stage? Well, that's somewhat unclear. Mike Daly does have a bit of a section on this proposed arcade jaunt in his own story of Lemmings from 2006. Data East USA's CEO apparently greatly loved the game, particularly its two-player versus mode. But while this prototype shows some promise, presumably somebody decided that Lemmings was just not going to work as an arcade. Even with the global timer, it is perhaps a little bit too long for arcade purposes. So possibly understandable, although it may have been worth a go, just considering the game's popularity. We also have Mike Daly to thank for the preservation of this prototype. When DMA Design moved their offices from Dundee to Edinburgh, Daly made sure to save the PCB from simply getting chucked into a skip. So thanks, Mike. I mean, for Lemmings in general, not just for saving this prototype. We're still in 1991, and Mutant Fighter is next up on the menu, or Death Braid as it's known in Japan. This is the sequel to the 1989 game Hippodrome, a game that, well, I really didn't like at all. I found it to be an almost intolerably basic one-on-one fighter for the time. Mutant Fighter is a bit better, I suppose. We move away from single-plane fighting to something that's more like a wrestling game, one where the various monsters come together for grappling and are now able to use all kinds of moves against each other, including big old super moves that you have to charge up and will usually end the match outright when they're used. It's still kinda mediocre, to be honest. At least you're able to actually choose a character now. Putting this arcade into a bit of context, SNK released King of the Monsters in the same year as this title, a game that's also trying to fill the same hybrid wrestling fighting hole as this one, and is a hell of a lot more effective at doing so. When you compare the two games directly, I think it's easy to see why almost nobody remembers Mutant Fighter at all nowadays. Murphy's back, and this time, well, it actually is personal. I mean, it's always going to be after a gang of criminal scum shot you to ribbons, leaving you with half a head and a brain inside a big robot body, and all the crappy memories of being killed and losing your loving family to look back on. So obviously this is RoboCop 2. Data East provides the game of the film once again, and it's another good one. In fact, this is one of my favourite Data East arcades. It's a hybrid between beat 'em up and shoot 'em up, one where you've got free movement, but Robo's also got a free license to blast everyone with his Auto 9, whether they're armed or not. It's kind of weirdly easy for an arcade game. RoboCop certainly feels a hell of a lot stronger here than he did in the first game, where he could pretty much be blown away in seconds if you made a one move. But this does do the trick of making you feel a lot more like Robo, a part man, part machine walking emissary of public trust, whom most of the creeps on the street have quite literally zero chance of not being annihilated by. If I were to look at this game from a strictly arcade operator perspective, business and all, I would have to dock it points for being something that even first time players can spend ages on with just one credit. But as a game, damn, it's really quite cool. It's a bit of a shame that this version of RoboCop 2 never got any kind of home port, to be honest. If you think all the way back to near the end of the last video, we saw Vapor Trail from 1989, a thoroughly excellent shoot 'em up, definitely one of Data East's best. Well, that game is actually the first part of a trilogy known as Kuga, and here in 1991 we have the second of these games, Rohga Armor Force, or Wolffan if you're in Japan. As Data East often does, they've changed a ton of things for the second game. What we've got here is an auto-scrolling side-on run-and-gun game where you're in a mech. In fact, if you didn't know about the connection the game has to Vapor Trail, you would probably be more inclined to think that this is a spiritual follow-up to Chelnov, as the gameplay's quite similar. On the whole, I'd say that this game's alright. It's not necessarily bad at what it does, but Data East certainly does have better side-scrollers than this one. Although much like Vapor Trail, this game is helped along by some excellent music. I just think it's perhaps lacking a bit compared to some earlier titles like the aforementioned Chelnov or Psycho Nick's Oscar. It's perfectly competent while you're playing it, but it's not something that really sticks in the memory for long after you've finished with it. One of the many things I like about Data East here in the 1990s is that they do continue to fly the flag for the classic single-screen arcade game, something a little bit old-fashioned, a game that features what a particularly grizzled old arcade-goer would have still been able to call boards or sheets, as opposed to levels and stages. We've got a fair few really great single-screen platform titles in this vid, and 1991's TumblePop is the first of them. You've got a team of ghost hunters, and your job is to travel around the world to various locales that are chock full of spectres. You suck them up with your vacuum cleaner, and then you release them as a ball that can knock out other ghosts. If you're able to hoover up more than one ghost at a time, naturally your ball will be bigger. Although you don't want to keep the ghosts in the bag for too long, as they will come out and scare you to death if you dawdle. This is a sort of comfort arcade game really. I've always got a lot of time for single screen platformers like this because they're such a quintessential arcade experience with simple, satisfying mechanics and the opportunity to score big and earn lots of gratifying bonuses. TumblePop fits in here as snug as you like, exactly the sort of quality game that you would expect from the folks who made BurgerTime. There is a couple of classically Data East touches too. Cameos for their most famous characters, and spelling out the game's title in order to get a really big bonus, in this case, a hidden stage. Naturally, this one is highly recommended. We're into 1992 now, and we start this year with a bang. It's time once again for Data East to let the sheer madness run free. Now I don't think Data East ever managed to reach the truly nutty heights of Trio the Punch ever again, that is the sort of high watermark it's hard to get back up to, but if you had to pick the game by them that came closest, while also being wonderful to play, well, Boogie Wings is surely the one. A game that has the even better title in Japan of The Great Ragtime Show, this is Data East's greatest shoot 'em up, by a long distance. As soon as you kick this one off, it's hard not to fall immediately in love with it. There's this whole mishmash of beautiful art style and flourish that's perhaps closest in the end to steampunk, but is definitely filled with a lot of Data East's own quirks, enough big set pieces to match Edward Randy in just about every stage, all of which have their own entirely different feel and are likely to stick with you for a good while after you've done, And on top of that, a whole lot of innovation. You've got the big bomb that you can swing around with your hook before releasing it, building up a big shockwave attack through relentless tapping of the button, and best of all, running along the ground after losing your biplane and being able to get into all sorts of other different vehicles, so many of which have their own special abilities. Simply having your plane shot out of the sky isn't the end for this legendary ace, that's for sure. This game is, well, it's absolute stark-raving genius. It is a shame that it never left the arcade. While I really don't think the Mega Drive or SNES could have possibly done this game any justice, it meant that Boogie Wings did get forgotten a bit as the years went by. But as time goes on, and more people have discovered it, there's more people now who'll champion it, as they should. In a time when there were so many shoot-em-ups, Boogie Wings was completely unlike all of them, and not just for weirdness' sake, but in terms of being actually innovative. One of Data East's greatest ever titles, an utterly essential triumph. Diet Go-Go from 1992 is an awful lot like TumblePop, but it's a little bit stranger. It's another single-screen platformer, only our heroes are no longer ghost hunters. Instead, they appear to be dietitians, stopping a mad professor, the evil Dr. Doggido, who was the villain in the first game, from making everybody in the world fat. They do this now by chucking sweets at the evil junk food throwing monsters, and then kicking them around when they inflate up to Mr. Creosote level proportions, ideally taking out other badniks in the process. So yeah, kind of strange. In many ways, it's tough to call this one a proper sequel, mainly because it's just so much like the original TumblePop rather than attempting to separate itself from it in any way. A lot of the enemies and settings appear to be exactly the same, and the food theme is not really consistent. It feels more like an expansion. The only other big addition is that your heroes do get a bit fat themselves if they get hit by an enemy projectile, but yeah, the play here isn't especially different from TumblePop, really. It's fine enough if you enjoy that game, mind you. In fact, it feels kind of like Data East were commissioned to make some sort of advert game version for TumblePop, something like Slim Fast or whatever. And even if the sponsorship, if it did exist, fell through, Data East ended up deciding to release what they had anyway because, well, why not? The aforementioned main villain, Dr. Doggido, is the big link here really. In fact, this is the second of 4 games that will see him take the role of lead villain, making him another one of Data East's recurring characters. Dragon Gun sees Data East make their entrance into the big old rail shooter genre. One of those light gun games that's not actually exactly a light gun game because it's played using big glorified joysticks that don't contain light gun technology. This has more of a fantasy theme similar to Dark Seal, which to be fair is quite a cool idea. It's certainly a little different from the likes of Operation Wolf, Space Gun and Alien 3, and the graphics here are very good. The actual gameplay is, of course, much the same as all of those games, so your appetite for it is obviously going to depend on how much you enjoy rail shooters like this. They're fine in my book, but they obviously lose quite a bit of oomph when played at home on MAME. Sadly, the game wasn't a hit at all, so finding an actual cabinet to play on is incredibly rare. You can, however, find one at the legendary Galloping Ghost arcade in the suburbs of Chicago, and man, it's a really lovely looking thing. It actually does have 2 big dragon heads acting as the joysticks, and there's even a speaker in the joysticks so that they can speak to you. Awesome stuff, clearly. We've got another single-screen title, and it's another rather odd one. This here is Funky Jet, a game developed by Data East but actually released worldwide by Mitchell of Pan fame. Rather than being the normal single-screen platform affair, this is a single-screen beat-em-up. You play as a boxer who can fly around the screen with the help of his jets, and your job is to land a big old right hook on all the other enemies that are flying about. Once again, you'll make combos if you can send another enemy careering into a bunch of others. So yeah, it is another quite unique concept. There aren't too many games like this where you've got thoroughly unrestricted movement, certainly not ones where you play as a boxer. It's definitely better than Flash Boy from all the way back in the Deco cassette system days, that's for sure. As far as how well it works as a game, yeah, it's quite decent actually. Once you get a good flow going and power yourself up a bit, it is quite entertaining for a while, and the boss fights tend to be a lot of fun. It's another game that's not very well known at all, of course, but it's definitely worth a punt. Our next title is very obscure. In fact, Hangzo is our second unreleased game. Opinions differ as to who actually developed the game. It could have been Data East, but it could have also been Hot B. What is for sure though is that the game runs on the same hardware that powers Data East's Rohga armor force, so it at least belongs here based on that. This is an action platformer, one that could almost be an unofficial shinobi game. You pick from 3 ninja warriors and do away with enemies using either your melee or ranged weapons, occasionally using some jujitsu magic or using a grappling hook to get around. It's not a bad game at all really. What we have here in this prototype is a largely complete game with 5 stages, a little rough around the edges in parts, and certainly not an especially flashy game for 1992, although no one seems to know for sure why this game never got finished and released. The prototype itself has been on MAME for a few years. It was won at an auction by a Japanese arcade collector named Showtime, who over the years has let MAME devs dump and preserve plenty of the rare and unreleased PCBs that he owns, and the actual dumping of the one was done by all-round good dude and friend of the channel, MAME Hayes, in 2017. This in itself is a jolly good story, and it's the work of fellas like Lee's that allows us to experience such games that would otherwise be just completely unknown. We've got another top-down run-and-gunner now, and this is another title where Data East turns on those big old engines of weird, the sort of game you could only expect from them. Nitro Ball is only slightly derivative in one area. The idea of a futuristic game show where you try to survive while earning loads of dosh and prizes is, of course, a fair bit like Smash TV, but the game itself goes in a whole other direction. Said game show is a completely out there cross between run and gunning and pinball. When you shoot enemies, you send them rolling around the level, ideally knocking them into other enemies or bumpers, targets, holes and the like, in order to earn even more points. Not only are there plenty of guns and the like for you to pick up, there's even a power-up where you can turn into a ball yourself and lay waste to those goons and bumpers and solenoids even quicker. Not to mention other little sections where you quickly have to meet a quota of targets and the like for more bonuses. It's all quite appealingly colourful too, much more so than what you'd normally see in a run and gun game. This is the sort of game that makes me love Data East. Even if a lot of the mechanics of Nitro Ball are pretty generic on the surface of things, you get this big fat twist that turns the whole game on its head and makes it a big standout title. Excellent game, definitely one you should play. Pocket Gal Deluxe is naturally going to be a bit more humdrum after the last entry. It is, as you expect, another pool game, and yes, it's another quite adult one. Again, mechanically this is going to be very familiar to you if you've ever played Side Pocket or Minnesota Fats, or basically any other top-down pool title. They're very average indeed, although this does at least have a twist of having to meet a points quota, something you can reach faster by getting those balls in the bonus holes. The graphics are better in the one single regard that most people playing would give a crap about, although Pocket Gal Deluxe makes the aspiring master player work a little bit harder to see those bosoms. You pick a model at the start and every time you complete a stage, you get another image of her in various stages of undress. It's only at the end where you get the full reveal, so to speak, and I certainly couldn't be asked enough to get that far. I fail to see why people wouldn't have just bought a copy of Mayfair instead. It'd probably cost less money and, you know, the models are real. We close out 1992 with Wizard Fire, the second Dark Seal game. Another fantastical isometric adventure, only with a couple of new characters and a couple more spells. You can now choose between a knight, wizard, bard, dwarf and elf. The ninja must have gone down the chippy, and once again every character's got their own little useful perks, such as the knight being immune to poison. This certainly isn't a sequel that reinvents the wheel, indeed it is very much more of the same. But then the first Dark Seal is a pretty decent game on the whole, and there's nothing particularly wrong with having some more of that really. I suppose I can kvetch a little, seeing as I don't have an awful lot to say about it, because I said most everything when I covered the first Dark Seal title, but I do see why a lot of people really enjoy these games. They make for a nice little isometric arcade take on the sort of dungeon crawling you'd have normally found in computer titles. We're into 1993, and it's time for Fighter's History, one of Data East's more infamous titles. The company decides that they want to get in on the big one-on-one fighting craze, and they do so with a game that, yeah, is certainly quite a lot like Street Fighter 2. It's a big martial arts tournament, you choose between 9 fighters all with their own sets of attacks and special moves, you beat up on the rest of the field and then take on the 2 big boss characters, the Clown and of course the almighty Karnov himself. You've got your martial arts guys with their bandanas and fireballs, a Bruiser Brody-esque strongman, speedy kickboxers, fancy lads with roses in their teeth, the usual bunch of people. As far as the game itself goes, I can't say I care much for it at all. It's just one of many rather humdrum fighting games that were inspired by Capcom's success. I find it all to be rather unimpressive and generic, the computer AI cheats like the clappers, and the weak point system isn't much of a twist on the formula. On the whole, it's just a rather average fighting game, and not a whole lot more. Being inspired by Street Fighter 2 is one thing, of course, but Capcom decided that Data East had gone a bit further than that and flat out copied them, so they sued. The story itself is quite well known, of course. In the end, the court decided that the similarities between the two games were inherent to the fighting game genre as a whole and ruled in Data East's favour. The amusing irony of the case being that a big part of the ruling was down to a historical case in which Data East USA sued Epix over the similarities between Karate Champ and the computer game International Karate, only for the case to be settled in Epix's favour after appeal for similar reasons. You couldn't make a karate game without using the elements that Data East claimed were copied from their title. And so on and so on. In the end, the case of Fighter's History versus Street Fighter 2 is a lot more memorable than the game itself. Next, we have a bit of future sports. It's Heavy Smash from 1993, a game of handball that occupies a similar space to the almighty likes of Speedball 2, although I wouldn't say this is particularly derivative of that. This is quite a fun one. You pick your country and then play a pretty quick-fire game. Pass that ball around as fast as you can, use both your kicks and charges to get the ball back when you haven't got it, all the while charging up your meter. You can either use this for a projectile that will disable an opponent if you've not got the ball, or for a super shot if you've got it that can send the ball, and the keeper, hurtling into the back of the net. It's quite entertaining, although it does once again feel oddly easy for a coin-op in that I never seem to have too much trouble winning a good few matches on this. That's not necessarily a bad thing unless you're an arcade operator who'd have wanted the machine to make some money, although it is a little strange. This isn't particularly famous even amongst the sports games that Data East did put out, but it is actually quite good. Right, here's another oddity. It's Seas Havoc, a platform game where you play as a pirate seal and try to rescue folks, find a glorious hidden treasure and all that good stuff. It's a perfectly fine game, especially when played on the Mega Drive. Indeed, you may look at this and think, hang on, this looks like a Mega Drive game, and there's nothing arcadey about this at all. And you'd be correct. This game is listed in MAME, meaning a PCB of it was found, but most people reckon that this is a Korean bootleg of some description, a Mega Drive game hacked up to run on an arcade board. It is still quite a mysterious one, mind you. The game doesn't work at all in MAME, after all, so until such a time as it does, there is still going to be a what if of this being some sort of unreleased arcade version of Seas Havoc, however slight that might be. For now, obviously this has all been illustrated with the plain old Mega Drive version of the game, running on a Mega Drive emulator. Data East go all provocative with their next proper title, the horror-themed beat-em-up Night Slashers. The zombies have naturally risen up from the dead and invaded the Earth, and it's up to 3 of the most powerful and badass horrific uninfected humans, the Night Slashers, to stop them from taking over completely. This is certainly one of Data East's best entries in the whole genre of walking and punching, although a big part of that is down to the vibe rather than the actual gameplay. The play itself is fine, of course. It's a whole lot like your final fights and what have you. I would say that it's a little bit slow compared to the best of Capcom's efforts, but it's perfectly acceptable. But no, this game shines when it comes to sheer buckets of blood. Data East didn't shirk at all it, making sure that any zombie you hit absolutely crumples in a pile of viscera. There's so much blood and guts, in fact, it proved too much for some markets. You only get the full uncensored experience on the Japanese version of the game, whereas other regional versions turn all the gore a certain shade of green. One of the likeable things about Night Slashers is seeing all this nastiness with good old proper hand-drawn sprites, most of which are very well done. Usually in this time, you'd associate it more with digitised characters thanks to Mortal Kombat and the like. Anyway, Night Slashers is a good arcade to stick on every once in a while, usually around Halloween when it goes perfectly well with the likes of Splatterhouse, Devil World and Beastbusters. Data East didn't have too many arcade titles in 1993. This here's our last one. At some point in 93, Data East made the decision to start making arcades for Neo Geo's MVS board, and this game here, Spinmaster, or Miracle Adventure, is the first of them. And it's quite a good one. This is a side-scrolling action game where you play as a hero named Johnny, once again trying to hunt for treasure and save your girlfriend from mad cyborg scientist and recurring Data East villain Dr. Doggido, who we last saw being generally evil in Diet Go-Go. You get a really lovely art style in this one. It all looks very bright and cartoony, with a whole bunch of characters and enemies that tend to be instantly memorable, and the action itself is quite good. Johnny's naturally excellent with his default yo-yo, although you tend to be picking up other weapons quite a lot, all of which are also handy and come with their own sets of special attacks. Again, it's another very good game from Data East that tends to be something of an unsung gem. Like a lot of these games, Spinmaster never made it out of the arcade. However, Johnny and his friend Tom did sort of make another appearance in the Mega Drive only platformer Dashin' Desperados, which came out a few months before this game. Here they're cowboys and they're named Will and Rick, although the characters are clearly incredibly similar to those found in Spinmaster. Unlike quite a lot of studios, Data East didn't make too many attempts at football games. Hell, there was only one in the video about their 80s arcade games, a very early title named Pro Soccer that wasn't very good. It's perhaps not surprising though that they'd make an exception for a World Cup year, and so they offer up Dream Soccer 94 for, well, 1994. Should they have bothered? Perhaps not. There's not an awful lot that stands out here compared to better arcade soccer efforts by the likes of SNK and Taito. You do get a chance to pick some tactics before the start of each game. Every team's naturally got their ace, there's super shots. It's all the usual stuff really. Very familiar if you've played the likes of Super Sidekicks, and games like that just end up being better. There's only a couple of truly significant things about the title really. You are able to commit some quite nasty fouls indeed that will work out fine so long as the refs are not looking, and the commentary is quite outlandish. He gets very excited whenever he has to announce a country's name. Other than that, there's not a whole lot to say here, although we will see some better sporty efforts from Data East in a few entries' time. Having shaken off Capcom's attempt at suing them, Data East made a sequel to Fighter's History in 1994. This game is known as either Fighter's History Dynamite or Karnov's Revenge. It's also made for the Neo Geo MVS board, which does mean that the fighting system has to be changed a bit so that the game's playable on 4 buttons rather than 6. You get a couple of new characters, as well as the ability to play as Clown and Karnov, the bosses from the last game. I would say that this is definitely an improvement over the first title. I'm certainly happy that the AI doesn't completely and utterly cheat this time around, and there is a bit more of a variation in the fighters. I quite like using Ryoko, one of the smaller characters who is actually incredibly proficient at judo and wins bouts by chucking much bigger foes all over the shop. I still wouldn't say that this game is a particular standout in the fighting game genre, but it shows a bit more potential. Alas, this was the last Fighter's History game. However, we do have a couple more fighting games to come from Data East before the video's end. Those lovely cavemen are back. While Joe and Mac's first game was pretty good, I do think that Joe and Mac Returns is even better. And again, it does change the formula considerably. In fact, it's another one in Data East's series of single-screen platformers, the one that started with TumblePop. Hell, it's even got room to fit in Dr. Doggido, making another appearance as the main villain alongside a couple of other cameos, including the almost necessary Karnov. This is the best of the single-screen games, although it does follow quite similar principles to the others. This time around, you stun an enemy by twatting it with your club, you stuff them into a sack and then chuck that around, hopefully taking out more enemies. It goes without saying that the bigger the sack, the bigger the ball's going to be. All good fun as ever, and the game's also going to want you to find cave women in just about every stage. They're often a little hidden away, but getting them tends to result in large bonuses. I find these games, particularly Joe and Mac Returns, to be gratifying in a thoroughly primal way. The sort of kick that I imagine people get out of things like Pachinko and whatnot. It's just a lot of fun to get into this game and blast around it for a while, racking up those points very quickly. This game sure may not be a complex one, even by the standards of the arcade, but who's complaining? Lovely stuff once again, and with this being the Caveman Duo's final game, it's a good way for them to sign off. We're going back to sport for a few entries, but don't worry, what we have here is by and large a lot better than Dream Soccer 94. Up first, we've got Street Hoop making its way to the basket. This is also known as either Dunk Dream or Street Slam depending on where you are. Usually when it comes to arcade basketball, people only talk about NBA Jam after a certain point. Not exactly surprising considering just how good it is, of course, but it's not like it's the only good one. Indeed, Data East, probably not the studio you'd expect, come up with a really damn fun take on street basketball right here. It tends to work for a lot of the same reasons that the old Jam does. Naturally, it's got the impressive dunks which you gradually charge up with a power bar, but it's got the same quick speed about it in everything it does, whether it's passing the ball up the court or scrambling to get on defence. It even has commentary. Not bad, even if it's obviously not as iconic as Tim Kitzrow. This appears to be a pretty popular game as far as Data East's later years go, so naturally we're going to see a sequel fairly soonish, but it is in many ways summed up as being like NBA Jam if it featured more traditional gaming sprites, and they actually managed to pull the game off very nicely indeed.
Check it out, Friday night, got nothing to do but sitting around the house thinking about you. Gotta get outside, I gotta get on the move, have the key to the wheel. Before we hit the schoolyard, heading on the truck with a playing all night, you know, we never know.
Right, the next game is another big one of Data East's very best. The final game of 1994 is the almighty Windjammers. I absolutely love this game, as do many others, and having originally discovered it for myself on May rather long time ago, I really love that over the years it's managed to become so prominent. This is another sports game of sorts, although it's very much based on one-on-one action. Pick one of the 6 characters and throw that power disc back and forth at ever-increasing speeds, trying to get it past your opponent in order to score 3 or even 5 points, depending on where you manage to hit. It's a simple idea, really. Hell, in many ways, it's a highly souped-up version of Pong, but it works so damn well. It's all about free-flowing play, trying to grab that disc and return it as quickly as possible, not to mention throwing in the odd special move if you've got time to charge one up. And for as good as it is in single player, it's obviously even better with another humanoid. There's a very significant amount of hidden depth to the game, even for something where sets just fly by in 30 seconds. The opportunity to take big risks, how much things change whether you're playing offensively or defensively, the ability to either power your way through or try and trick your opponent with something clever, the various tiny little details in individual characters' movement that matters so much when the game's played at a high level. There's a lot here, and it all comes in one of the fastest games that the arcade's ever seen. The game itself wasn't exactly a big hit when it first came out. Indeed, I think the fact that it was released on Neo Geo MVS hardware may have made some people think that SNK made the game rather than Data East. But in the end, the sheer quality of the game thankfully made it the hit it deserved to be. Giant Bomb started championing the game in 2014, making plenty of vids on it, and from there we've had all sorts of Windjammers inspired games, a full-blown sequel in 2022, a competitive scene building up around the original. Nowadays, Windjammers is absolutely one of Data East's best known and best loved games, and it's certainly more than deserving of such accolades. An all-time great arcade game. We kick 1995 off with more sports. One thing that's interesting about looking at a studio's whole library, as we're doing with Data East, is looking at the attempts in genres that they generally don't do. And while it's almost hard to believe considering the popularity of the genre, Backfire is one of the very few traditional racing games that the company ever made in the arcade. What we have here is a rally game that uses a more isometric camera, similar to the likes of Kaneko's 1000 Milia or Visco's Neo Drift Out. It's certainly a lot more detailed graphically than older entries in this field, and it being a rally game does at least give you more of a shot at reacting to the big turns, usually by drifting around them in spectacular fashion. Another big gimmick here is that Backfire is a dual-screen arcade, pretty much tailor-made for competitive racing even if, again, this arcade wasn't much of a hit. It's not a bad game, really. I struggled to rate it especially because I don't think I've got the controls configured properly, so the satisfaction that I ideally should get from slamming the car around these tight corners at high speed isn't really there. It's not likely to be a game that I go back to, as I greatly prefer a more regular behind the car view in my racing games, but it's certainly far from awful. Our big old sports section wraps up with Hoops, Data East's second trip to the basketball court, also known as Dunk Dream 96 or Hoops 96. This one's even better than the first actually. The core gameplay naturally hasn't changed too much, but the game does feel a lot faster. Part of this has to do with removing halves, instead just going straight in for one lightning-paced period of b-ball. There's also a little bit more added in the way of special moves. Not only are you able to perform a big dunk, as in the first game, you can also choose to perform a super 3-point shot or super defense, both of which will clearly come in handy at various points depending on whether you're a ways behind or you're trying to defend a lead. Once again, Hoops is quite possibly the best game in a big old chasing pack. Even if NBA Jam may well still be the kin at this point in time, Data East's Hoops really isn't that far away from it, and I find it to be a really damn enjoyable spot of arcade basketball. The sort of game where you're never too far away from your opponent, whether you're leading or trailing.
Hit your boot, double clutch, rebound, no basket, block shot.
So, we are getting closer to the end of Data East's arcade years. As the big countrywide recession started to hit companies hard, they gradually found themselves in financial peril, regardless of the quality of games they were making. Still, there is time to introduce another hit franchise, and it's a puzzler this time. Magical Drop is definitely one of the best known and most successful titles from the company's final arcade period, and rightly so, because it's one of the best competitive puzzle games ever made. Of course, the original concept wasn't entirely theirs. Magical Drop had its origins in Russia as a 1992 DOS game called Drop Drop, which came out in the West as part of a puzzle compilation named Moscow Nights. Data East licensed the title and eventually made this game, tweaking the gameplay a bit and adding a huge chunk of anime presentation with various tarot-themed characters competing against each other. The core of the title is match-free, with the ability to grab as many of the same colour drop as you can before throwing them back up the well, ideally at another of the same colour. There's a couple of special drops too, but in the end it's all about big combos and, of course, being more efficient than your opponent. Once again, Magical Drop works based on its sheer speed. There's almost no time to hesitate with this game, and you've just got to flow and react fast. It's very satisfying when you get into a rhythm here, almost as if you're one with those drops. Competitively, it's glorious because the momentum shifts so much in every match. There's plenty of times where even if you feel as though you're just about beaten, it's possible to turn it all around with the right move, not to mention the various matches that appear to go right down to the wire. Again, it's a really wonderful title indeed, and we'll be seeing a couple more magical drops before the video's end, that's for sure. We have a couple of fighting games next. Weirdly, the one that never ended up getting a release is probably more famous than the one that did. But first is the game that actually did make it, Outlaws of the Lost Dynasty, also known as Suiko Enbu in Japan. As you may be able to gather from the two titles, this is a game based on the water margin, featuring 12 outlaws going against each other to prove their strength in combat and earn fabulous wealth. Although actually looking at the game, you may just want to describe it as Data East does Samurai Showdown. That's not wholly fair, mind you. Outlaws of the Lost Dynasty is actually quite a good fighting game, certainly Data East's best. Yeah, the similarities to SNK's game are pretty clear, but the fighting itself is rather enjoyable. There's even the odd opportunity to juggle opponents here and there, which is always nice to see in a 2D title. Again, this title does seem to be quite obscure, although it did get a couple of home ports, the best one naturally being on the Sega Saturn, seeing as the arcade actually runs on Sega's STV hardware. Data East aren't exactly the best fighting game studio, to put it mildly, but I quite like this one. Right, time for another unreleased game, and hoo boy, are you ready for Data East Does Mortal Kombat? Yes, it's Tattoo Assassins, a game that was scheduled for 1995, but didn't make it despite being almost finished. The reasons why it didn't make it are fairly straightforward. This title was actually developed by Data East's North American pinball division as their only attempt at a video game, and it ended up cancelled after said pinball division was sold off to Sega, having received some rather poor write-ups in field testing. However, the development itself was anything but straightforward. The non-existing Dan's Tattoo Assassins page tells horror stories from the coders of Constant Crunch, being docked bonus pay for the slightest misdemeanour, leaning over the side of a desk to vomit into a garbage can before going straight back to work. Not to mention some of the stranger points of the title, such as the game's setting actually being the brainchild of none other than Bob Gale, the Hollywood scriptwriter of Back to the Future fame. He often sent his work-in-progress scripts to his friend Joe Kaminkov, head of Data East Pinball, and Joe decided to take one of these ideas about tattoos coming to life and fighting each other, and make it into a game. The game itself is, well, it's certainly as ultra cheesy as you would expect. The characters are pretty bloody hilarious. You can choose everyone from a Power Rangers cosplay act to a violent figure skater, which must have been a Tonya Harding reference of sorts, just to date this game a little bit further. There's even a character named Hannah Hart, which just brings back memories of old YouTube and My Drunk Kitchen for me. The gameplay isn't necessarily terrible, but it is, again, what you would expect. A lousy rip-off of all the things that Mortal Kombat does, so many times better. A couple of the ideas are different, being able to choose a morph weapon, not to mention all the fatalities, with there being around 200 of them, ranging from fighters' individual finishers to some global death moves that anyone can use, ranging from the somewhat graphic to the utterly silly. I mean, it's something. Tattoo Assassins in this form is pretty bad, of course. It's certainly not the worst MK ripoff ever made, and it wouldn't have been the worst thing for it to get released, but the creativity does largely run out once you get past the famed screenwriter's concept. Finally, in 1995, we have World Cup Volleyball 95, a game that's as simple as the title would suggest. No frills here, it's just a rather standard volleyball game, with all the bumping, setting and spiking and whatnot, and as such there's not an awful lot to say about it really. You see a few volleyball games here and there in the arcade, and if I'm honest I've never been able to find one that I've particularly enjoyed. They just always seem to be rather samey, and Data East's effort here isn't much of an exception, just very generic and kinda lousy. Some titles really don't require a whole lot to be said about them. I mean, they can't all be Tattoo Assassins. Let's just move on.
Match one. Nice serve.
1996 is Data East's final full arcade year, and we begin with the first of two unreleased games from it, Airwalkers. This is another Data East basketball game, only this time it's in full 3D using the Sega Model 2 hardware. If this had been released, it would have been Data East's only full 3D game in the arcade. While the game's listed as not working in MAME, what's here does appear to be playable, albeit with a few audio and graphical glitches. The not working part appears to be more to do with the 4-player support that the game should have. This is fine as far as early 3D basketball goes. It's much more of a straight-laced attempt at the game compared to the likes of Hoops, mind you. The game does rather strangely switch camera angles halfway through, although I wonder if that's just for demonstration purposes in this prototype. Once again, there's not a whole lot to write about here. It stands out purely as being the single example of Data East making a 3D game for the arcade, but the game itself likely wouldn't have been on the same level as what they did with Hoops. It appears as though the game was simply a victim of time. The prototype that we have for it is dated December 1996 and was presumably going to be released in 97, but it must have been cancelled following Data East's retirement from the arcade business. The one existing board of the game was found in early 2020 and dumped onto MAME a couple of months later. Here's something fun. 1996 saw the release of two big arcade fighting games involving Marvel Comics franchises. Capcom's X-Men vs Street Fighter is the one you most likely know already, considering how big a deal it was, and this is the other one. Avengers in Galactic Storm, the Data East title that could have never possibly hoped to match up. Loosely based on the comic book storyline of the same name, with the Avengers going up against the Kree, this isn't Data East's first rodeo with these characters, and here they're presented in digitised, pre-rendered form, something that people may have been starting to tire a little of in 1996. It does feature some other elements that were becoming more common in fighting games, such as the ability to choose an assist character who can come in for their own moves, as well as the super moves that were by now ubiquitous. It also has a story mode with cutscenes between matches, a la SNK's Art of Fighting. So, is this game a stinker? Not totally, unless you were to compare it to the games by Capcom that were lording it over everything else. It's certainly a better digitised fighting game than Tattoo Assassins, that's for sure. But it's easy to see why this game was virtually blown away. Reports at the time from mags like Next Generation predicted that this game was never going to be able to compete in the fighting game market, and they were absolutely correct. Nowadays, it's not much more than a possible answer to a trivia question. Here's our final unreleased game, a title called Ghostlop. This is another competitive puzzle game, one with a big old Arkanoid style twist and a title that reminds me a whole lot of the age-old Grapplop or Clusterbuster. Ghostlop has some nice twists on the formula. Much like Grapplop, you have to hit those spectral grapes and ideally send a bunch of them crashing down in order to send stacks of grapes careering down the opponent's well, but the rather unique twist here is the ability to switch colours. You have blue and red grapes, and the ball can only take out grapes that are the same colour as it, although you can switch the ball's colour at any time. I guess the most famous examples of such a mechanic would be the treasure games Ikaruga and Silhouette Mirage. It's a pretty neat mechanic, and I can see how, if you got really damn good at the game, you'd be able to switch seamlessly between the two colours while the ball's in flight, taking out as many as possible, not to mention using it for accuracy, taking out a bunch of blue grapes that just happen to be hanging from a single red grape. I think the game's pretty cool, but apparently SNK decided not to publish the game after it performed poorly in field tests, which is kind of a shame. The prototype ROM has been available on MAME for a long time. An arcade collector named Billy Pitt acquired one of the cartridges that were used in the aforementioned field tests in 2003, and shortly thereafter he sold the proto on to a French team who were going to produce a few cartridges of it, purely with the intention to sell to other collectors. One of these cartridges was purchased by a group of Neo Geo community members who ponied up enough funds to buy it, and from there it was promptly dumped for everyone to play. Such is the way of things really. Some protos are dumped via careful negotiation, others by community efforts, and some others by brute force.
Ready, go! Let's go!
We continue to be quite obscure. This is Yanken game Achimi Tehoi, a rather simple little amusement that was only released in Japan. Are you one of those people who just couldn't get enough of playing rock, paper, scissors in the Alex Kidd games? Well, this is the title for you. You pick an opponent, and you simply play a Yanken match with them, all while singing the classic Yanken Po song. Whenever you win a match, you also need to correctly guess the direction that your opponent looks in, an odd little quirk which I must confess has never been part of any Yanken match that I've personally played, but apparently is a common variation. The cabinet itself is quite cool, very colourful and with a huge joystick that you either release for paper, press one button on for scissors, or both for rock, and then move in the predicted direction. So yeah, this is all rather simple and casual. An innocuous little trifle of a thing that you would expect to find in a Japanese game centre, a redemption game that you play for a bit and hopefully earn a few tokens on. Truthfully, the high quality of the graphics and animation here really do carry this one, and go a ways to actually making it an amusing little experience. The second Magical Drop hits arcades in 1996. While there's only a few differences between this and the first title, there's certainly enough to have an impact. The main difference, of course, is hardware. As with more and more of Data East's games, Magical Drop 2 is using the Neo Geo MVS system. Other than that, you do get a bunch more special drops such as the Rainbow, Ice and Arrow, all of which have their own functions and also now have their own colour, meaning it's a bit easier to trigger them by matching them up with regular drops of the same hue. Other than that, well, it's got everything that's in the original really. Sequels to good puzzle games, for obvious reasons, don't usually tend to reinvent the wheel all that much when it comes to their core mechanics, and when you've already got something as excellent as Magical Drop, yeah, that's going to be enough. We stick with the puzzle genre for our next game, but but this is a much more obscure one that never left Japan, Masuki no Ojama The World, another largely competitive game where you take your pick between various pre-rendered creatures and go at it. It's another match-free game, one where the tiles fall down the well in much more traditional fashion, but the difference here compared to the more classic games in the genre is that you mainly match tiles diagonally, which causes them to sprout wins and fly off to the other player's well, creating a stack at the bottom. Said stack can be removed by the opponent if they match tiles of the same colour, and that makes up the back and forth. It's pretty humdrum, to be honest. Especially after something like Magical Drop, this game doesn't exactly come off as anything that special. It appears as though there were plans for the game to get released outside of Japan. A dive into the ROM's code revealed that there's a Western title screen hidden in there, and the game would have been called Kiss Off overseas. Said dive into the code was performed by Hayes. Doesn't half get about now, does he? Next we have our final shoot 'em up. Skullfan is the third and final game in the Kuga trilogy, coming after Vapor Trail and Rohga, and this time we go back to more traditional fare. It's a good old-fashioned top-down game, much like Vapor Trail. Or is it? As it turns out, this game does have a few strange foibles, which we will be getting to. It should be said that at present Skullfan simply doesn't work in MAME, however it did get a Japanese-only port to the Sega Saturn, and that's what I'm playing here. When you load this up, things seem somewhat normal. It's the sort of shooter that you would be expecting to play at the time, one with a fair bit of pre-rendered graphic action going on that perhaps hasn't held up awfully well. If I'm honest, it doesn't look nearly as good even as Vapor Trail, and I certainly wouldn't want to compare this to the likes of, I don't know, Dodonpachi. That just wouldn't be fair. However, I did mention the odd foibles. Skullfan has a speed selection system that doesn't just affect how fast your ship darts around the screen, as normal, it actually affects how quickly you traverse the whole stage. If you have it at full whack, you will reach the boss faster. This actually really mainly comes into play during those boss fights. Often you have to chase them and then try and maintain pace with them using the speed selection. Pretty nifty. Another feature was something I learned from an excellent in-depth look at the game available on the 1cc log blog. The game features the same roll feature as Vapor Trail, but it's much more in-depth. You can actually, while you're using it, change the direction of your ship. You can turn it backwards, or even turn it to the side. Horizontal firing in a vertical shoot 'em up? Yeah, that is quite out there. Now, I was never able to get the hang of how to do these things, unfortunately, although I could at least make it turn 180 degrees. Even with all this in mind, this is still only a half-decent shooter, as opposed to a great one, although it's certainly toying with some unique concepts that I can't say I've seen in all that many other vertical shoot-'em-ups. There's one final sports game to be found in the Data East library, and it's baseball. Now, usually arcade baseball games fill me with resignation and boredom. The company had a particular one in the 1980s, Stadium Hero, that certainly fit the bill for mundanity. But this here is Stadium Hero 96, and hey, it actually is a good deal better. I mean, you'd bloody well hope so, considering the years of difference between the games, but Stadium Hero does thankfully play a much, much faster game of ball. It's like I'm a dog, the game's took my hat, 'cause all dogs wear hats, shoved a piece of steak inside of it, and is now making me chase it. Tortured analogies aside, this is a technically fine bit of baseball. A lot of the annoyances that were in the first Stadium Hero, such as the cruddy fielding, aren't really there anymore, which is nice. It is still baseball at the end of the day, so it's never exactly going to be a favourite of mine, but it's a decent enough game that will entertain me for at least a couple of innings.
Throw to second. He's out of the park! Home run!
And here we are, Data East's final arcade game, and their only one of 1997. Magical Drop 3. Now, I could perhaps be resigned to ending things by not saying too much about the third game in a puzzle series, but there are a bunch more tweaks to this one, a big part of it being a more pronounced difference in all of the jesters and how they play, enough that it's pretty damn noticeable. There's also even more of them, 22 characters in the game, with 6 of them being unlockables. It should be noted that Magical Drop 3 features an adventure mode, something styled after a board game that mixes up both single player tasks and battles against rivals if you're both on the same square. While this would be the last Magical Drop game in the arcades, Data East would continue the series for a little while longer in the home, releasing Magical Drop F on the PS1 in 1999. Despite a few breaks here and there, the series continues to this day. Magical Drop 6 was released on PC and modern console platforms in early 2023 by Forever Entertainment. And there we go. That's the end of Data East's arcade library. It wasn't the end of the company as a whole. They did develop and publish games for consoles until 2000, before retiring from video games completely, reverting to electronic products and engineering, which was always something that they'd been involved in alongside games, and then eventually going wholly bankrupt in 2003. They are very much a company that define a time period in the arcades, from the golden age right up to a point where 2D arcades started to be treated as something very outdated. As one of the many gaming companies that just couldn't quite make that transition to the 3D world, they don't quite have the legacy that a lot of their more famous contemporaries do. But they, alongside other companies like Technos or Jaleco, made some highly influential and impressive contributions to the arcade that deserve to be remembered, some of which are still actually active today. It's certainly been fun to look back on their work, and hopefully you've enjoyed it as well. But until the next time, bye for now.